we'll assume people are going to trickle in, or they're at home frozen. Thanks for coming to hear Dr. Casey O'Donnell, which we'll get to in a second. 3 announcements before we start. The mini conference for the Create Institute is next week, Wednesday, February 25th. And the keynote speaker is Rick Dushel. If you've never heard him talk, you should. He's fascinating. And I'm supposed to emphasize with great authority, right, Rini? Today is when the poster abstracts are due. So if you haven't done one, you should. And if you think, I don't have anything to show, you do. You just have to do one. It's easy. Right? Get them in today. What time today,
Huge
Rini?
authority. We'll take it any time today.
11:59 and 59 seconds?
Yeah.
That's what my students always ask. Super. Well, you got till then. That's a long time. Put
can write an
off
abstract.
whatever
You
you're
can write
gonna-
an abstract.
Put off whatever you're going to do this afternoon. You can write an abstract right now while Casey's building it. The second announcement is that the Co-Integrate Math Talk with Andrew Krause is on February 27th, and I assume that there's more information on the Create website about that. The third announcement is that the Create Science Seminar, which is coming up on March 4th, will be Ron Gray, who's from Northern Arizona, and he will be the third speaker of our Science Studies and Education Things, which leads me into our second speaker. He's sitting right over there. That's Casey O'Donnell. And as a reminder, Casey is the second speaker of this sort of series of looking at science studies, so why science is the way it is, and people who think about that, and some education ideas at the same time. So Casey is an assistant professor here, although he put it in his tenure materials, right? Sounds like it's going cool. He's in the Department of Media and Information here at campus, so you can find him. And I will say, if you're interested in what he's talking about, in the fall, the Science and Society at Stake, S3, we always have a seed grant program that's about $10,000. And the purpose of that is to integrate people who don't usually work together. So Casey says something that you find interesting, and you're from the College of Ed, and he's there, you guys should talk and put in a seed grant. Casey's research examines the creative and collaborative work of video game design and development. The research examines the cultural and collaborative dynamics that occur in both professional organizations like the AAA and informal and formal independent game development communities. His research has spanned game development companies from the United States to India. His first book, The Developer's Dilemma, is published by MIT. Casey himself is an active game developer, releasing Aussie, or OC, how do you say it?
Aussie.
Aussie. In 2011, Against the Gradient in 2012, and Glitch in 2013, and he's been funded by NSF and NIH. And let's give him a warm round of applause.
So, thanks to David and to everyone here for the invitation, and Zach for logistics. So, I want to talk a little bit about sort of where I come from in terms of field a little bit in training, because it's a little bit strange, and I think it helps understand my work if I say a little bit about that ahead of time rather than trying to explain along the way. So my PhD is actually from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in upstate New York, Troy, New York, and it's from the Science and Technology Studies Department. So in the Science and Technology Studies Department, you get a lot of anthropologists, sociologists, and historians who like to study the phenomenon of science and or technology development. So that I wound up there for my PhD, and it really shaped how the kind of scholarship that I do. My advisor was an anthropologist, trained at Rice in the anthropology department. So anthropology and ethnography runs deep through my work. But when I started in this program, game studies as a field was fledgling at best. It was founded, the Digital Games Research Association, which was sort of the first attempt to solidify game studies, was 2003, which is when I started my graduate studies. And so in 2005, when I said, am I going to do games? Right, that wasn't an easy choice to make. And there were 0 people coming from a science and technology studies background looking at games. And so I've done a lot of bridge building between STS and game studies, whereas something like anthropology has had more connections to games. So the interesting thing about this work is it's caused me to go back and look at a lot of old ethnographic data of mine. So in 2005, I was sort of in the middle of not in the middle, I was at the beginning of my dissertation research. And I'd become really convinced, because when I started my dissertation project, I was like, I just want to study software developers. And then I kind of had this moment where I was watching artists and designers and programmers yell at each other that this was different. It wasn't just software development, that this was a different kind of phenomenon. And there is a field called software studies, which has its own methods and ideas. And some people have, on occasion, said, well, isn't this just software studies? And so I wrote a whole essay about how, no, what I do is not software studies. Note to graduate students, sometimes you use that feedback for future papers. But in 2005, I found myself at the Serious Games Summit in Washington, D.C. The first Serious Games Summit was in the spring of 2005. And I went in part because I was in the middle of my dissertation work, and this was a new thing, and I said, well, am I looking at serious games? What is this thing? So this Washington, D.C. based event coincided with the release of the Xbox version of America's Army: Rise of a Soldier, which meant that at this event there were people with guns and Humvees, and it was really strange for me, coming from, at the time I was studying people who were working on Spider-Man 3. And so that military focus of the event sort of made me go, nope, not serious games. It shoved them off to the side. So this isn't what I'm doing for right now. But in the time that followed, between 2005, 2007, things changed. If you're interested in reading about America's Army, and particularly somebody who's done really great ethnographic work on it, Rob Allen has done some fascinating stuff. And there are some super funny and interesting stories about America's Army and the fact that the game development team totally dissolved because they had philosophical issues dealing with the military, and then the Army had to figure out what to do with all this money they'd spent, and so it's a really interesting story. And so at the time, I was really just 9 months into my dissertation research, which ended up being a 3.5-year ethnography of a AAA game studio, which this book is based on, so you should go check it out. It's from MIT Press. Book plug. But in 2007, when I was finishing my dissertation, something was changing in the game industry, right? And it was the rise of an increasingly energetic and growing community of, quote, indie or independent game developers that started making me think differently about what games can say and what they can do. Because I'd been studying the AAA game industry, and that was Spider-Man 3 and Call of Duty and these big titles, and something was going on in the indie scene that was really different and interesting in terms of the medium of games. And also as part of a subcommunity of a subcommunity of game development was this community of art game developers. So in 2006 and 2007, there were 2 games that were released. This one is Passage, made by Jason Rohr, and another game called The Marriage, which I'm not going to talk about. But they were really interesting new core categories in my work that were reflections by game developers on the world around them. So rather than trying to make a movie game or a shooting game, they were trying to understand the world through games. And Passage is a game about life and death. I'm going to read a little bit of this. As a player, you are given 5 minutes to play the game, and literally the game ends at 5 minutes. You can explore or not. You can seek out treasure chests or not. Eventually, in your movement in the game, your male-looking avatar may find a female-looking avatar. If the two touch, they travel the world together, which also means that some paths are no longer accessible. Irreversibly, throughout the game, the clock ticks up. At the beginning of the game, just at the top, your character appears to the left of the screen. The right side of the screen appears blurry and difficult to see. As time ticks away, the character's position shifts to the right of the screen. By the end of the game, which inevitably comes, the past is blurry, and there is very little to look forward to. If you've found a partner, at some point, they will die. Your small character will stand next to a tombstone, leaving the player only one question left in their mind. What do I do now? Just like life. And we could ask lots of interesting questions about the narrative of this game, right? And things like heteronormativity, race, right? Because there's no option. Gender. But Passage, so those are excellent questions. But I also want to reflect on the fact that Passage was a designer's attempt to come to understand his inevitable death and the death of a partner. And I read in this game something very different. I read, treasure this journey because it's the only one you're going to have. And that was different. This wasn't something that I'd seen games attempt to say before. So I finished that first project. I wound up at the University of Georgia and ended up collaborating with some folks. And so I meandered back into serious games. In February of 2009, I joined a team of researchers at the University of Georgia interested in designing educational technologies. The team was funded by National Institute of Health Science Education Partnership Award, or SEPA, and games weren't really part of the group's charter. They just happened to be using a game engine to make their things. And so then when they saw that, oh, University of Georgia has hired a game guy, let's have him come talk to us. Right, so up until this time, I'd never really claimed the role of game designer. I'd worked as an engineer in the game industry before I went to do my field work. And suddenly they were asking me, well, are we making games? Which to me was a very, I had to take on the role of game designer. So I wouldn't have called myself an expert, but they certainly thought I did, and I fit into the team. So I said, well, you can have me as a game designer and a game developer as long as you let me watch you and take notes. And that was the deal that I struck with them. So then I spent another 3.5 years with this group of scientists, educational researchers, teachers, and students designing things. And so this is actually Aussie, the second version. And Aussie actually just got greenlit on Steam, so which is really cool. It just means that people can make fun of her in another case. So, but it was new and interesting for me, and it was a chance to see games in a different space. And so, starting in about 2007, you had a lot of research going on about the potential use of games in the classroom. Right, so. The idea that games could play an important role in teaching the habits of minds of scientific practice, so Constance Steinkuhler's work. You had other people looking at World of Warcraft, Mark Chen's work, and looking at leadership, as well as scientific habits of mind, so sort of reverse engineering games outside of educational contexts. And I think it's important to talk about serious games and say something about edutainment, right? So I'm a child of the 80s, and you have to acknowledge that edutainment exists. And serious games are not edutainment, right? So when I look at something like Oregon Trail, as nostalgically, fondly I look back on it, what was the best part of Oregon Trail?
Dying of dysentery.
Dying of dysentery. This is one everybody.
Crossing the river.
Crossing the river.
Getting across the river.
Fishing.
Shooting. Remember, you get to shoot at the deer. That was the best part of the game. Yeah. You know, I mean, so number munchers. Not the highlight of the possibility of what games can say, despite, as I say, how we can nostalgically look back on them. But this rhetorical move, right, back in 2005, and should not be odd that the person that coined the phrase, Ian Bogost, is a rhetorician. And so serious games was a real move to reframe the conversation around games. And it presented an opportunity for researchers, developers, and funders to cast games in a significantly different light than traditional, right? These are serious, they're not entertainment games. And within a few short years, new academic and professional conferences emerged focused specifically on these kinds of things and their creative trajectories. So Games for Change, Games Learning in Society, and the Games for Health conferences are really excellent examples of where scholarship emerged around these things, right? And it was about playful learning experience. But there's always a trade-off. And so from 2007 until 2012, I was really excited and enamored by the possibility of serious games. And I immersed myself in game design and beginning to include that as part of my repertoire. Indeed, I teach game design classes here at MSU. When most people think about the narrative of games or the messages that games can deliver, they think about the visuals, right? The stories that the games deliver. But the game design is also about system design, right? And it's those systems that provide the meaningful feedback to the player. And games are a collection of systems, subsystems, that provide a variety of feedback loops to the player. And games can be relatively simple or complex, right? Those mechanics, those systems can be simple or complex, but they're always information systems, right? Even non-digital games, even board games have a game state, and the player's actions shift that game state. It's an information system. But in the case of a digital game, those systems and those feedback loops can be numerous, right? In the way that a non-digital game can't. It just becomes overly complicated. But a digital game can track tons of information, and not just can, it needs to. That's how it responds to the player. And so also during this time, so as early as 2000, video games started incorporating what they would now be called analytics. And ostensibly, early on, it was just to understand, well, what machines are these games running on, like what kind of graphics cards, what kind of processors, to understand what their users were doing, right? If a game crashed, it would collect information about that. But game designers and developers started saying, we can actually do more with this. This is actually some analytics from Aussie. And so this is level progression, and you can see that we have a difficulty curve problem, right? Players dying. And that, so you get this sort of play. I have another graph that's about typical play usage for a serious game versus a traditional game, and also versus a learning game. And basically, learning games, the usage curve is a crash, whereas, yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What do you mean when you say serious game?
Good question. So a serious game would be a game designed first as a game, but secondarily as something addressing some more serious topic. It's ambiguous, but I would say oftentimes they can be social issues, learning. So partially I would say you're right. It's an ambiguous term, maybe even a throwaway term, which is part of why even people like Ian Bogost have kind of abandoned it, because they're not sure what it means, because all games can be serious in one way or another. Even those entertainment games, that serious games were rhetorically set up against oppositionally. So, yeah. But as the power and potential of this kind of data gathering and analysis increased, information about playtime, number of times a player succeeded or failed, it offered insight into a game. If a game item was too weak or too powerful, right? So there's oftentimes in games there's what's called nerfing. If you've heard this, is where they take a powerful weapon and they make it less powerful because it was too good, and they're rebalancing the game. What levels or areas are the most popular? What are players doing? And this information was used to adjust the underlying systems within games. And in some cases, players were upset. They would tweet nasty things at people, as apparently gamers tend to do. But for the most part, it was accepted with little care on the part of the players, right? They would get mad when a gun got nerfed or something like that. But for the most part, it was just part of the normalness of games, right? They're this opaque black box, and if it's tracking data and the black box changes, that's just part of how it works, right? Games were already surveillance systems, right? Players were used to it monitoring them and tracking their data. It was just part of what the game did, and the fact that it might change or adjust wasn't strange. It was no different than the game itself. It was normal. And particularly for serious games, and particularly learning games. which is, I co-founded a learning game company that spun off of this SEPA project. Analytics and surveillance and algorithmic analysis of the information that games can produce became really appealing. And it's a big part of the push right now in learning games. So like, what can we track to stand in for the user? And often because serious games projects, because they're expressly serious and may not be as market friendly, involve funding agency that desire proof of impact. And while there are numerous forms that proving process could take, increasingly analytics became part of that answer. And there are numerous examples of the growing primacy of testing, and particularly about surveillance of both students and teachers that I could talk about. But this was just one piece of it that began to give me pause. And so as the educational possibilities began to come in conflict with my rising concern about games as obligatory judgment systems. So what do I mean by that? Games that might not even be games. So T.L. Taylor has done some really amazing work about emergent coercive systems in games, right? That because of the nature of play and because of the nature of player communities, that there are these very coercive systems that can manipulate players to do things that they might not otherwise enjoy or want to do. And I am increasingly interested in not just emergent coercive systems, but downright coercive systems that are worth some scrutiny. And it was this quote from ODonnell that had me come back and question analytics. So this is a quote from Ronell's book called The Test Drive. If today's world is ruled conceptually by the primacy of testing, nuclear testing, drug testing, HIV, admissions testing, employment tests, pregnancy tests, SAT, GRE, MCAT, DNA. This growing dependency on the test is coextensive with Nietzsche's recognition of the modern experimental turn. The experimental turn, as we know it, is from a history of flukes, successes, and near misses. In its genesis and orientation, travels way beyond good and evil. And so I started to go back to the early philosophy of games. And what made games special was that you need not submit to them. They're a space of play governed by rules that are by definition optional. And so I came back to Passage. It was a rupture. It was the first time I'd ever seen a designer attempting to model a system that was important to them. Most game designers are interested in modeling economies or balancing attack and defense system, which is basically an economy too. And so I started to think about this idea of Careware. And it first centered on how game designers take very real-world systems and come to understand them as games. I often crack the joke to my students that gamifying the classroom is actually a fool's errand. It's already a game with badges. They're just A, B, C, D, and F badges. But that if we can think about even the DMV as a kind of horrible, awful game, it's actually the investment of the users in playing the game that gives it its social weight. The game's surveillance, in one form or another, is inevitable. But what happens when the force of those rules extend beyond the borders of a game into everyday real life? So does anybody here have the thing you connect to your car to make Progressive give you a lower insurance rate? Okay, good. Right, that's a crappy game. But increasingly, jobs, healthcare systems, very great many real-world systems that everyday players of them begin to be judged by opaque algorithms of arbitrary design. And as a game designer, I need to find that problematic. And so I started trying to find an analytic term for some of these things. And at first I called them obligatory games. It was that obligatory part that really bothered me. I looked at if games are required in the classroom, and especially if I'm designing a learning game, am I just making the next form of dodgeball? Because I don't want to make dodgeball. But then I didn't like obligatory games as a core category. And so I went back to Bernie DeCoven's work, and he has this great book that was actually just republished called The Well-Played Game. And here are just a couple of quotes throughout the text. We were willing to do whatever we could do to allow the game to become a well-played game. We would never have discovered a well-played game until that willingness was recovered. And he has this repeated use of the word willing and stopping, right? So it's essential that we figure out some way to tell when it's time to stop the game. And from there, I went to Bernard Suitz's early work. He has this book called The Grasshopper, which is delightful. And he too comes to the conclusion that games are at their core unnecessary. Playing a game is the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. And in his definition of games, like at moments in this dialogue that occurs in the text, he acknowledges that some of the definitions permit the classification of certain things as games which are manifestly not. And so, at the time, I proposed a new analytical category for obligatory games, and I said, let's call them out specifically. Those are broken games. A broken game is not a game. Broken games subvert the option. Broken games are systems of judgment representing themselves as games, but they demand that you play. And perhaps worst of all, these judgment systems are assuming that you will lose if you don't play. You must demonstrate your nature by playing them. That's a broken game. And so I stepped back a little bit from learning games because I was worried about that. But I didn't actually come to really talk about broken games. I wanted to talk about science crowdsourcing games because you can see that there's sort of this temporal overlap here between projects. And in 2011, I saw this headline. And all I could think to myself was, what, gamers did it, so it's easy? So I went and downloaded Foldit. Checked it out. It's freaking hard. And it's not that much fun. Why are people playing this? Right? I didn't want to play the game. And so I went back to some of my work and I said, there's a kind of epistemological disconnect between what counted as knowledge for an educator, a scientist, a designer, a teacher, a student, or a superintendent, right? And that's really what I was getting grumpy about. I was interested in authority. And clearly, gamers don't have scientific authority here because what they're doing isn't science, even though they're doing science. And so I began percolating on a new project, which resulted in a National Science Foundation grant, collaborating with a person at Temple University that knows the science way better than me because I know the games and he knows the science. But we proposed a study to look at two science crowdsourcing games, Foldit and Eterna. I'm going to talk about Eterna more in a little bit. I'll talk about Foldit first. So, but why science games and not crowdsourcing games or citizen science specifically? Why? Because crowdsourcing is big. And it wasn't the crowdsourcing part that was really interesting to me. It was that interface between the designer, the player, the scientist, and education, knowledge. And again, going back to that critique of the epistemic regime of the test. And I also want to say a little bit about gamification because it always comes up in these contexts. This is Tiny Subversions. His name is Darius Kazemi. He makes weird internet things. And one of the things that he made was a Chrome plugin for your browser that anytime it encountered the word gamification, changed the word to Exploitationware. And I've actually written a couple of papers about sort of the rise of gamification and that rhetorical turn. And so I'm not going to try to untangle that here. I'm happy to talk about it a little bit if people are interested, and particularly the fact that so many gamified projects really do rely on a great deal of analytics and surveillance as part of where my critique of it came from. And it was interesting to me that this was the first time I'd ever actually seen game developers mobilize to critique projects that leveraged games. And so I want to say that Foldit and Eterna are not gamification, even though proponents of gamification will often say that they are. Right? They'll also point to things like Nike Plus or Fitbit, and they'll say, this is gamification. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, and I actually want to say that Foldit and Eterna are very much not gamification. Something different was happening in this space. And if gamers can solve AIDS in ways that big science hadn't been able to solve, then something interesting is happening here, and it deserves its own kind of attention. And I wanted to know what players knew about science, right? And I wanted to know how it related to the very technological artifact that they were playing with. I wanted to understand how a protein folding game was like or different than an RNA folding game, because it turns out they're totally different. And in particular, like, what does the game itself do? What framework does it provide the players? Clearly, as years of research in science and technology studies would indicate, our tools shape our understandings of the world around us. But what about what those things themselves are hybrid actors, right? Designed by game designers and in conversation with scientists and engineers. Like, that's a really complex technology to tug apart and make sense of. And I wanted to know more about the gamers, because the thing that really ticked me off was nobody talked about the players. They would just talk about the scientific team. Because the reality of the situation was that it was actually a combination of the contenders and the void crushers that solved that particular problem, the protein related to HIV. And look at the kind of activity that these top teams are taking here, right? This wasn't gamers solving a protein folding problem. This was a community of players working intensely over the course of 10 days. This was hard. It was so hard that what most people don't know is that the protein was thrown out to the community as a lark. The research team at UW didn't think they could solve it. They were like, whatever. It was such a hard protein for them that they chucked it out to the community, said, see if they could do it. And sure enough, 10 days later, they did. And also recognize the massive difference between your top 10 teams here and those below them, right? That it's actually a relatively small, dedicated community of players. This is not a community of knowledge producers to be trifled with. Now, of course, with success and good press comes all sorts of new questions, like who gets credit? Which was a legitimate question for the Foldit team. And they actually went out to their community to ask for recommendations on how to credit those who had labored for the answers. And as can be seen in 2010 and 2012, they're actually, right, so we go from Foldit players to literally crediting the contenders group, the void crushers group, in journal publications. And so this was really interesting for me, that the community of players and researchers at Foldit, recognizing their independence, began to create this really generative community, this generative system. They have chats between developers and players. The interaction level between the team and its community is really, really high. So we talk about Eterna, which really hasn't broken any of nature's secret codes. It's not really famous. It's gotten some good press here and there. But Eterna is really different than Foldit. And part of that is that RNA folding is just less understood than protein folding. But the original computer scientist that worked on Foldit was one of the original founders of this project as well. But like most computer scientists, his interest was not in citizen science, right? He was interested in graphics and how things folded, right? Literally, his dissertation was about the folding algorithms that were used visually to represent the protein folding. That's what he was interested in, but we all get typecast occasionally, and so when he arrived at Carnegie Mellon, he was somehow roped into this project. And so Eterna really presents a very different face to its players. You can create an account or not. You can use Facebook to log in. Everything about Eterna looks and feels more like Nike Plus than Foldit. It's got shiny badges, rocks all the components necessary for a successfully gamified science project. You don't have to download a client. Eterna is a Flash application that runs in your browser. And it looks and feels a whole lot like Bejeweled or Candy Crush. And what was interesting is the mechanics of the game. Foldit tries to present this very realistic, very authentic tool for folding proteins. And Eterna doesn't really care as much about the actual mechanics of RNA folding. It's a relatively simple matching game that uses energy expenditure and attraction between chemical bonds to fold things. Another way, what folds in Eterna may or may not really fold in real life, versus something in Foldit, which if it folds in Foldit, in all likelihood will fold in real life. Eterna is a 2D model of a 3D process that isn't very well understood. And if you watch what happens in the background, I'll show you an image here in a second, players aren't really contributing to actual understanding of folding, but potential folding. The information is stored in massive databases, which can then be mined in the future for more likely solutions to the random brute force methods that a computer might take. Basically, people are really good at these kind of puzzle games, and so maybe they can help a machine get better at folding RNA. Machine learning models take the best candidates generated by people and search for best case possible solutions on new sequences. What's interesting about Eterna is that it's constantly moving between these virtual data sets and actual protein synthesis in a wet lab at Stanford. Right? So that's an interesting step that they've made. When Eterna began, they were only able to synthesize 30 possible candidate structures a month. Now it's more like 300 a month. And it works. Right? Players are generating massive amounts of data for the research team, helping them better understand the underlying mechanics of RNA folding. And one might assume that sometime down the road, a different version of the game might be released that looks and feels more like Foldit, providing a realistic kind of interface. But it's very different from its predecessor. And rather engage directly with its user community, Eterna has opted for an external community management firm, Get Satisfaction. And while some of their team does interface with players on Eterna, much of the messy part of interacting with players is handled by contract or external employees. And one even, you just start to watch what the underlying guts of Eterna is doing to recognize a very different kind of system from Foldit. If I were to show you something similar from Foldit, there would be like 2 lines because everything is talking to the servers at University of Washington. But in this case, Eterna is rocking the latest and greatest in what Silicon Valley has to offer in terms of venture capital-backed science. Amazon S3 servers serve up image components, with the only CMU-fed Carnegie Mellon University components being the consistently updated Flash Swift file. Eterna looks a lot less like citizen science and instead more like big data production. And I'm not saying that is the case, but based on early evidence, it's clearly different as such. And I think there are important implications for science, games, and players. And so the goal of this ongoing project is to understand this relationship between these very different interests and the consequences for scientific knowledge production. These players, in conversation with these tools and with these communities, have a real knowledge claim to authority that they really lack. They just don't have the language for it because they're just gamers. In 2009, I played 2 games. One was the Irish game. or Shiokon Lot. It's the bottom one. The other one was Train, designed by great game designer Brenda Romero. Both games need to be played because she ascribes to this idea that the mechanic is the message. And these are non-digital games of which only one exists. So, in order to help illuminate how I've been thinking about Careware, I'm going to totally ruin Shiokon Lot for you. So, one player plays as the side of the Irish, the white and green, and the other as the Cromwellian British invaders. Orange boxes uproot those who previously lived on sites and must be relocated. The goal of the person playing as the Irish is to keep as many people as possible from being uprooted. Orange's goal is to simply place all of their blocks, but they must be done so adjacently. So yes, my last name's O'Donnell. Playing this game as an Irish person was a moving experience. As I attempted to relocate my displaced families, I was forced to break them apart. As pegs began to knock one another over in my attempt to squeeze them into increasingly crowded quarters, I imagined to myself bar brawls or neighbors fighting with one another as the space was eventually used up. Eventually, assuredly, the pegs began to fall from the board. And as revealed to players at the end of the game, these became two distinct separate groups, those that perished and those that were forcibly relocated to Barbados as indentured slaves. And I thought about my family's flight from Galway and eventual relocation to the United States and Boston in particular. Those systems of dominance and oppression had an effect on those that eventually emigrated away from Ireland. I thought about checks that my grandmother may or may not have written to the IRA, and I was hurt and mad in a way that I'd never been before. And you don't want to know how weird it was when I played as the Cromwellian force. And so Shiokon Lot, the Irish game, and Train signaled to me that Careware isn't just a one-way street, so back to Passage, that it isn't just a designer trying to make sense of the world. Careware and game, a subset of Careware as games, started as a meaning-making system for their developers, but they became systems really crafted with the care that someone would play them and care for the very same systems that the people developing them cared about. Games provide a meaningful playback to players in ways that are recognizable, and by rendering the rules opaque, the player must make their own sense of how to play within those things. And I use the term meaningful play here. I draw on Eric Zimmerman and Katie Salen, but it's actually a concept that I'm working to shift. So, put simply, meaningful play is the feeling on the part of a player that their actions have recognizable effects on the systems of a game. Right? That actions have consequences. It's what makes games feel good. But I think you can actually invert that relationship and say that game design or system design is actually a means of making sense of broader systems, and that isn't included in this idea of meaningful play, and I think it's actually a really critical component, that designers build these things with meaningful play in mind. So it's a conversation between the designer and the player. And so games and Careware are deeply rooted in systems that simultaneously objectify the world around it, right? These are digital systems. They take the world and they slice it up into really awful, arbitrary rules. The discrete computational logic of games and computers, so this bucket, not that bucket, clearly create meaningful disconnects. Yet at the same time, those objectifying moves are done in order to construct systems that get played. Players tell stories. They subjectively regenerate new narratives. I can tell you a story about playing Passage, the Marriage, the Irish game, Shiokon Lot, that exceed its rules. A game is more than the sum of its rules. Yet without those objectifying moves, that subjective understanding would never have occurred. It would have been impossible. And so I took these really care-filled experiences and tried to bring them forward. I tried to embody them in my science learning games. How can I make games that give students a feel for science or a scientific topic? So I made a game about osmosis. I made a game about cellular transport. I made a game about type 2 diabetes and a game about neuroscience with the explicit goal of it not being necessarily recognizable as a game about diabetes or neuroscience. And time and again, the question came back, well, are they really learning it? To which suddenly, game analytics was an answer that beguiled even me for a while. Maybe we can avoid testing them if we can prove properly designed and tracked or surveilled systems that learning was occurring. And so, when I talked about broken games, you can hear that I initially jettisoned care when I was thinking about serious games. But I saw them as somehow kind of broken. But looking at Foldit and Eterna and the intersections of those things with broader worlds of game-based surveillance under the name of user analytics and systems imbricated by big data, it wasn't just broken, that there was something interesting going on here. The stories that players tell, Eterna and Foldit players tell, a game that isn't fun. They talk about grandmothers or mothers with breast cancers, friends who have died, personal experiences with illness and a desire to make a difference in the world around them that oftentimes they feel like they can't make a difference in. And while I can retain my concerns about exploitation, I must also acknowledge that these users aren't blind, who've been sucked into some system. And a mentor of mine back from graduate school prompted me at an early iteration of this talk that even at the darkest of times, a picture that I could paint quickly with surveillanceware, exploitationware, broken games was still imbricated by care and meaning making. And of course, I can still maintain that there are limits to this, and I like to cite Natasha Schull's work on autoplay, where she looks at gambling machines and gambling addiction, right? So that even care can be subsumed into systems like this. But games, whether being made or played for better or worse, remain meaning-making systems. They're kind of like oxygen. Necessary, beautiful, deadly, dangerous. But it's that oscillation between objectification and subjective sense-making that lends games their real power. It makes them both interpretive as well as deconstructive. The systems of the world around us are as opaque as games, right? The normal world is not a fun game to play. But games have discrete systems that can be teased out. It's what makes them fun, what makes them interesting to players, right? Because they make sense in a way that the real world doesn't. They're explicitly constructed, right? That makes them open to criticism and refactoring in ways that the system in the world around us does not. Eric Zimmerman recently wrote, and now he's a game designer, so take this for what it is, but he wrote about that this would be the ludic century. And so, in some ways, that sounds self-congratulatory. But I think Eric is actually being more subversive. He believes that the world needs more game designers, because in an increasingly algorithmic and mediated and constructed world, seeing the systems around us as open to revision and redesign is important. It's not games are everywhere. It's that the world needs more people interested enough, careful enough, and hopeful enough to make sense of a world that is increasingly a mess. That's it.
All right, so we get a few minutes for questions here, Casey.
Okay. I think I went long. Yeah.
So I want to talk about Foldit.
Yes.
And you said you were looking at the people who play Foldit, and I was kind of interested in who they are. I play Foldit. I have my students play it, but and you can correct me if my impression is wrong, but I think you can play Foldit without learning anything.
I think that's entirely possible. I think the difference is if you play more than a little bit, you learn something. I think even the stupidest of games, we start hypothesizing about their systems. If we engage with them for longer than a passing moment, right? I don't think you can.
So I guess I was curious about, there are 10 teams who are, the winners.
Yeah.
So what kind of people are they?
That's a wonderful question. And so let me just pull up this one. All right. Most of the top players are 20, 30, 40 somethings with real jobs and lives so they're not your traditional gamers. They are people that have found Foldit and see it as an interesting platform through which to contribute to science that makes sense to them and is enjoyable in a way that some other activity wouldn't be. And as I said, the majority of them have some story to tell about, well, I'm an engineer at this company, and I do my job and I come home and I feel like I'm contributing to society in a way through Foldit that I couldn't otherwise. And you hear a lot of those stories. There are also some that worry me a little bit more. So actually one of the top players for Eterna, she lives over in Grand Rapids, and she's an MSU grad from the biology department. She has an undergraduate biology degree, and she works at Abercrombie, and a bachelor's degree in biology. But 10, 15 years ago, she probably could have gotten a lab tech job. But because of the shifting nature of science funding, she lives at home and works at Abercrombie and plays a ton of Eterna because she's still fascinated by biology. And so it's more problematic, but I really admit that. And so to me, that's, I think, one of the critiques is that increasingly, if you look at how the shifting field of science funding, and some of what's going on here really is asking people who might otherwise have been able to pursue science to now have it as their hobby. Was that a wave? Yeah.
All right, so I'm not sure I have a question in here, but sort of a thought that I was hoping you could help me with. You talk a lot about meaningfulness, meaningful engagement, and also about games and broken games. And I work in K-12 settings, a lot with teachers around science. And one of the things that I do a lot of is I think about scientific practices and how to help children and their teachers become meaningfully engaged in scientific practices in schools. So it seems to me like there's a lot of analogies between the work that you're doing and these settings that I see very much as game-like environments, the trade-off of doing what you need to do in a classroom to get a grade or to get, and then, so we're operating in that setting, but trying to create something meaningful within that broken game setting.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, you sort of gave a few clues as to how you thought that might be possible, something about being optional or not. So I'm wondering if the ability for children or teachers to opt into this game or not to opt in might make it seem more meaningful or not, or what are some of the factors that you see as contributing to meaningfulness that might play over into that setting?
So, I think one of the things that, and we can't make everything optional, right? Because then we just choose to not do the things that are hard. Right. I hated biology in elementary and high school. Like, it was my least, I loved physics, right? Because a bunch of equations. Once I figured out chemistry was a bunch of equations, loved it, right? I loved algebra. But biology, I hated because it was messy. right? Stuff didn't work right. You try to put a slide together, and it didn't make any sense. And when I was working on Aussie, the thing about it was, I couldn't have told you, right? Osmosis was when I walked into the room. But one day, they had a slide with blood cells in hypotonic and hypertonic solution, and I looked at it, and because I'd worked on this game, I knew exactly what that was, and I was interested again. And so when I think about the meaningfulness, is that having a chance to make not so optional activities exploratory in ways where people find the meaning. An example, so when I talk about broken games, one of the examples that I use, because game studies people we don't point to sports enough. And so a broken game for me would be football in Texas for high school kids, right? For high school men, right? That's not optional, right? If you're going to be socially okay, you play football. And so that's broken. But what's fascinating is I look at sports now as somebody who teaches game design, and I see some really fascinating games, right? Because they mean something different to me. And I think oftentimes things are presented, the non-optional things, the things you have to learn, are presented as things you must know. Here's an equation. Rather than, here's a thing that you can explore and play with. And it may or may not have something to do with this piece of content, right? So there was a kid in the early testing of Aussie. He was playing it, and he's playing around. He's like, this is kind of like that hypotonic, hypertonic thing, right? And I went, it's not kind of like that, it is that. And he went, what? Really? And they were interested in a way that really shocked me. And I think a real concrete way is providing places where making those things you need to know meaningful or mean something to people. And you're not always going to catch them, and this is the problem, that when you still need to know it, but it doesn't mean anything to you until later in life, just as, my English classes didn't have as much meaning for me until later in life when I went, I wish I had paid more attention. And so some of that comes from experience, and I think helping people make personal experience of the learning material, that exploratory moment. I think that's one of the reasons why I love game design, is because anytime I get asked to make a game about something, the first thing I have to do is go read about it. And that has become the fun part, right? So, working on a Jewish rabbinics game. I knew nothing about rabbinics. Clearly, his last name's O'Donnell. But relating it to even my own experiences of growing up Irish Catholic. So I think that's one of the real concrete ways. And so when I tell these stories about games, that's how I've made meaning of it. And that's what I really enjoy about that subjective, letting people tell stories about their experience of those systems that we want them to know.
Any more questions? Right, well, let's give Casey another round of applause.
Again, thank you for the invitation. I hope it was.
And we have, of course, the Great for Sim mug.
There you go. Excellent.
Thanks for doing it. Great coffee mug. And again, unlike most of our speakers, Casey's on campus. So if you have a game that you want him to talk about with you, like a Jewish rabbinics game.
Yeah, I didn't plug the Games for Entertainment and Learning Lab.
You should now.
We partner with lots of folks, both on campus, off campus, and I would say a year doesn't go by without submitting at least 2 grant proposals, in partnership. And we've partnered pretty extensively with folks here at the College of Ed. So.
Yeah, very good. All right.
Thank you again.
Yeah.
Thank you.